Hi Bethlehem, this is Pastor Paul. This past Sunday we continued on with our sermon series entitled Kingdom Stories as we have looked at a few of the parables of Jesus. Now remember, a parable is a simple story that illustrates a truth. And in the case of Jesus, Jesus told parables to illustrate the truths about the kingdom of God. And to really, truly understand these truths, or to understand the parable, you have to come and listen to what's being said. You have to meditate on it. You have to process it and pray about it. That is how you begin to really understand what Jesus is saying. The parable that we looked at on Sunday is the parable of the two debtors. Jesus told this parable in a very specific situation. Jesus had been invited to a dinner party at Simon the Pharisee's house. These dinner parties would be held out in open courtyards, and the entire town would gather there to listen to what was being said. They also came in hopes of having some of the leftovers, because these are people who are living at or below poverty. And during this time, a woman comes from the crowd, goes to Jesus, kneels at his feet, cries on his feet, dries his feet with her hair, anoints his feet with perfume. And during this time, Simon is watching this, and he's thinking to himself, hey, this man is no prophet, because if he was, he'd know what type of woman was doing this to him, and he'd have nothing to do with her. And Jesus, knowing what's going through Simon's mind, tells him this parable. So we find this in Luke chapter 7, starting with verse 41. Then Jesus told him this story. A man loaned money to two people, 500 pieces of silver to one and 50 pieces to the other. But neither of them could repay him, so he kindly forgave them both, canceling their debts. Who do you suppose loved him more after that? Simon answered, I suppose the one for whom he canceled the larger debt. That's right, Jesus said. I think the point Jesus is trying to make is found in the fact that neither one could repay the debt. Now, if your perspective is just on how much you owed, Simon's right. He wouldn't have as much gratitude for the forgiveness, because he'd only see that his debt was 50 pieces of silver. See, contrast that with the woman who came to Jesus, and she saw this large amount of debt, 500 pieces of silver. And she was grateful because she knew she could never repay it. When we understand that God's grace isn't just making up for what we lack, but it is actually doing something that we could never do on our own, we will be eternally grateful to God. That's what Jesus wants us to understand, that our sin separates us from God, and we can never get there on our own. And so apart from God's grace, we will be eternally separated from Him. God's grace does what we can never do. So our big idea is we need a proper view of our sin to properly glorify God. We need a proper view of our sin to properly glorify God. And our challenge is to ask God each day to open our eyes to the problem of our sin. What does our sin really look like? How is it affecting our lives and those around us? Hey, thanks for listening, Bethlehem. I hope to see you Sunday at the fair at 9:30. See you then. God bless.